Good morning. Black, blue, female. Those three words have defined who I am for over half my life. Black, my race. It's the first thing you saw when I walked onto the stage. Blue, my career. Heather just told you, otherwise you would not know. And female, my gender. So I'm going to tell you a little story, and I'll probably tell you several stories before this is all over because I like telling stories. I have been told I'm a good storyteller. So in the first grade, I had an assignment to write, and that assignment was to write what you want to be when you grow up. And in the first grade, I wrote that I wanted to be a cop or a lawyer. And I don't know why, in retrospect, when I think back on those things, I don't know exactly why I wrote that, because I didn't have a cop or a lawyer in my family. But all I could think of is I watched a lot of Dukes of Hazzard back in the day, and all I could think is I wanted to be that cop that helped Roscoe P. Coltrane finally get Bo and Luke Duke for all the nefarious things that they were doing in Hazzard County. That's all I can think. And then when I think back about the lawyer concept is I think about my family watched a lot of Perry Mason, and if you guys remember any Perry Mason reruns, he was the lawyer that helped get the innocent good guys off. And so I was thinking that, hey, maybe I'll be a defense lawyer like Perry Mason and get these good guys off. And so fast forward, I am now in, I'm thinking about the, cop or lawyer thing, and I'm in high school. And so when in high school, I'm like, in the 12th grade, and I'm deciding at that point if I'm going to go to college or not. And I will tell you that neither of my parents went to college, and my grandparents did not go to college, so no one told me that I had to go. But I assumed and figured if I wanted to be a cop or a lawyer, that I needed some college education. So I took my hard-earned money. At that time, I worked at McDonald's and Baker's. I loved food and I loved shoes, still do. So I worked at those two places, and I took my hard-earned money and I applied to two colleges. The first one was the University of Maryland at College Park in Maryland, and the other one was Howard University in Washington, D.C. I got accepted to both colleges, but opted to go to the University of Maryland because I understood as a black female that I would get some additional funds. I would get some scholarships and perhaps some grants, and that did indeed happen. So what I want you to remember about this is the fact that I went to college because I wanted to be a cop or a lawyer, and so you take ownership of your own, your own future and do those things that you have to do to get to the point where you want to be. All right, so this is another assignment. So I'm at the University of Maryland at this point in time, and I am in my first year. I'm in my English 101 class. I'll never forget this. And I have to write what it should be or would be the jacket of a book that I was to author. Now in this class, I call it the beginning of my onlys. So in this class, I am the only black person in this class. So I'm surrounded, with all my white classmates. And I figure if I'm going to write a book and I want these folks to read it, maybe I'll stun them with something like this. And so these are the words that I wrote. I am a double negative. I am black and I am female. So I'll back-lace this story with I'm still in college, still my first year, and I go to visit my grandparents in St. Helena's Island, South Carolina. And so while I'm there, I go and my grandmother asks me, how's college going? Of course, I say it's going well. She says, what's your major? And I tell her my major is criminal justice. And she asks, well, what do you want to do with this criminal justice thing, she says. And I said, well, ma'am, I've known since the first grade I wanted to be a cop or a lawyer. And, I had to use my ma'ams and sirs back then. So my grandmother said, well, a cop or a lawyer, you know what, you need to do the lawyer thing. It's a safer route for someone, a little black girl like you. And so I didn't really understand it at that time, and so I was really feeling myself because I questioned my grandmother again, and anybody that's from the South and grew up with a grandmother knows that you don't question your elders, but I did that day because she's talking about my dream here. And so I said, well, why not the cop, ma'am? And so my grandmother told me, and I'll never forget this, she said, the police officers in our communities do not treat people that look like me and you any good. You do not want to be a part of that. And so that very semester, I went back to the University of Maryland. I changed my major from criminal justice to English because I was of the philosophy at that time, and I still am, that if you know how to read, write, and talk, you can be or do anything. So I just want you to remember when you think about my double negative story, and me being the only person in that room that looked like me in the University of Maryland. It was an uncomfortable feeling, but it was just the start of me being of my onlys. So that uncomfortable feeling, I began to become comfortable being uncomfortable, because it happened time and time again, not just through my school, but through my career. So, race, Black, African American. I started with that because it's definitely the first thing you see. And when you look down at, if I opted not to, if I had to check a box, this is the box definitely that I would check. But if I opted not to check that box, if you look at the bottom line there, it says that if I choose not to self-identify, that this information will be determined by a visual survey. So if I opt not to check that box and I opt not to tell you that I'm Black, guess what? You're gonna know anyway, right? So I'm gonna tell you another story. When I went out of town to do a career day, and that assignment was in Walterboro, South Carolina. So fast forward, I do the career day. It ends up not being just a career day. It ends up being like an auditorium full of people, and everyone asks really good questions. But on the way home, I decide from Walterboro, South Carolina to Atlanta, Georgia. I'm in Atlanta at that time. I decide to drive back that same night instead of spending the night. And I take 95 South, and then I take 16 West, and I'm on my way home. And at some point, I see on the overview there that there are 2 police officers, and they're running speed traps. And I look at my speedometer, and I am speeding. I'm getting it because I'm trying to get home. I want to make this 4-hour drive 3, and I'm really, truly speeding at that time. And so I pull over because I know they're coming for me. No need to make them chase me, so I know they're coming for me. I pull over, and so the first thing I did was I downed both of my windows, and I put my hands on the steering wheel, and I did all those things that people talk about when they talk about the talk and driving while Black. So I do those things, and I wait for them. And so while I'm waiting for the first officer to come, I have all these thoughts in my mind, because I know that I'm driving while Black, but I also know that I'm driving while I am a police. So, but they don't know that, right? So I was driving my government-owned vehicle, which was an undercover car. The windows were tinted, very dark black. They had to have been illegal. And my tag, if you were to run that tag, would have not shown up in the system. So I know that these police officers are doing those things because at some point I was a street cop. So I am a little bit nervous. I'm anxious. I'm driving while Black, I'm driving while armed, even though I'm lawfully armed, but I'm a little anxious here. And so what happens next is the first cop comes, he comes on my side, and my hands are still here on the steering wheel because I don't want him to, think that I'm doing anything kinky. And so when he comes over, I start talking kind of fast because I see that the other person, more than likely, has already run my tag and found that nothing came up. So I'm talking kind of fast, and I said, "Sir, I'm a federal agent. I understand that I was speeding." So I'm kind of talking fast, and I tell him that I am armed. When your person comes on this side of my window, he will see that I am armed, because at that point I don't have my suit jacket on. My gun is exposed. And so he goes, "Okay," and he yells over to his partner. He goes, "She says she's a federal agent." And so the partner comes over, and certainly he sees the gun, and I totally keep my hands right here the entire time because I still don't want them to think I'm kinky, but I still have to prove that I am who I say I am. So I ask, "Well, sir, can I get my commission book and my driver's license and get those things so you can see these things?" And he said yes. So I lean behind me, I grab my commission book out of my bag, I show it to him, and my story, obviously it verified that I am who I am. So my story ended amicably. I'm a big talker and I like chum. So I asked them, "Hey guys, do you like chum?" They said yes. I gave them pins, coins, patches, whatever I had, and they did not give me a ticket that day. So my story did end up really good. But I say that story and I tell you that story because statistics show that driving while Black, I was anxious because of that, even though I am a cop. So the statistics that come along with that, these are all truths. These are things that truly have happened and do happen on a day-to-day basis. Blue, you see the smile? I lived my dream, y'all. I became a cop. Yes, I did a 25-year career as a law enforcement professional, 3 of which were with the Uniform Division of the United States Secret Service, and the remaining with the special agents in several different offices, field offices within the Secret Service, and a few at my headquarters. I spent 2 years at the FBI's Joint Terrorism Task Force in Atlanta. Then I got promoted as a supervisor in Washington, D.C. And so that's kind of how my career went, and it was a wonderful career. But I'll tell you about my very first time, drawing my weapon. I was a Uniform Division officer at the time, and what we would do, I worked on at Foreign Missions Branch, and at Foreign Missions Branch we were the street cops pretty much. And we would listen to Metropolitan Police District of Columbia radios and sometimes make those response. And so I'm in there with my partner, who we both shared the same last name and first initial. So it's D. Grant and D. Grant. And so the other D. Grant, they started calling him Big Country and me Little City. And we were as different as night and day, D. Grant and I, big old country strapping white guy, and then me 25 years ago. And so we go out on this call, D. Grant and I, Big Country and I, and we get there, and I'm following his lead because he is the senior guy, and I'm not on OJT, I'm a full sworn cop, but I still am following his lead. And so he comes out and he's making commands, and the 2 people aren't listening to him. And so I do my commands, and I'll interrupt my own story and say that when I was giving my commands, I made my voice much deeper because I didn't want to be a whiny cop, right? I wanted them to understand and respect me, so I made my voice deeper. And so I'm giving these commands in my nice deep voice, and they're not listening to me either. And so at some point, Big Country pulls his weapon, and then, of course, I follow his lead, and I pull my weapon. And ladies and gentlemen, let me tell you, the first time I pulled my weapon, I was scared. I was thinking about so many things in my mind, and one of the things that I thought about was, what would make these 2 people not listen to us? We are uniformed officers, you know that. Why aren't you listening to us? I'm thinking about what might be going through their minds, but I'm also thinking about my SOPs, my use of force models. I'm thinking about the rules. I am a rule follower. So I'm thinking about the rules that I have, and am I supposed to be, what am I doing here, and making sure that I'm doing everything correctly. I'm also thinking, at some point, my grandmother's voice comes in my mind. And this is really profound because the first time I ever pulled my weapon, ladies and gentlemen, I pulled it on someone that looked like me. I pulled my weapon on a black female. And so my grandmother's words resonated with me. She said, police officers in our community do not treat people that look like me and you the same. They don't treat us very well. And I, at that time, knew for a fact that I was there to serve and protect, and that I was doing all these things correct and right. But I couldn't stop thinking about that because I knew that I was not a part of the problem, that I was going to, I was a part of the solution there. And so, long story short, the incident ended up well. I think the guns in hand actually obviously made them become compliant. And so we holstered our weapons, and we were able to arrest the 2 individuals without incident. But I say those things, and I tell you that story, not just to say that, I had my weapon. It's a gamut of things go through officers' minds when they are in a situation when they're pulling a weapon. But I also want you all to know that there is no place in law enforcement and policing for implicit bias. There is also no place in law enforcement for bad apples. And when people do things that are wrong, it makes all of us who serve and protect, it makes us all look bad. And so that's kind of what my point is on that one. So what can we do? What are my challenge to you, and what are the things that I think that will help us? I think I think we're doing it now. We're talking about, I'm standing here telling you some of my stories, some of my truths, some of the things that I went through. I'm telling you also that I was the only in many situations, and that was very uncomfortable for me, but I became very comfortable being uncomfortable, and that's kind of what we all have to do. Talking about race and talking about racism is uncomfortable for a lot of us, right? But it's more uncomfortable if you look like me if we don't talk about it. We have to start having these very candid, open conversations about race, racism. I mean, you're thinking about a country that just has very deep historical roots surrounding race. And so we need to talk about those things as a group. One of the things that I also believe we need to do, I think about Rodrigo's class for those of you who has taken that, and one of the things that he says is get out of the building. He's challenging people to get out of the building. And so when I think about getting out of the building, I'm thinking about your chiefs, your assistant chiefs, your everybody getting out, talking to their officers, seeing what's going on in their minds, and talking about those things that are happening in our communities. And I also think about, when I'm thinking about getting out getting out, is also at some point you have to come back in. You have to come back in and you have to talk about diversity and equity and inclusion. But you can't do that on a learning management system, ladies and gentlemen. You cannot do that sitting behind a computer. You have to be face to face like we are right now and have those tough, deep conversations in person. And so that's pretty much what I wanted to talk to you about. I really want you all to embrace being comfortable, getting comfortable, being uncomfortable. I really like that. And let's start now. Questions?
Thank you, Dee. Which did you find more challenging, your race or your gender, as you went through your career?
So that's easy for me. It's not, my race is what it is. I think, discrimination happens, but in my position, it wasn't blatant discrimination. There were things that might have happened because of my race, but I would say certainly my gender. And I'll tell you a couple of stories really quickly. When I got pregnant, it took me a long time to tell the job that I was pregnant. I was almost 5 months, and my doctor told me that I had to tell because now my baby, my unborn child, could hear. And so I went and I told my supervisor this, and my supervisor at the time was a female who did not have children herself. And so, long story short, I was in a preferred assignment at that time. I was in protective intelligence operations, and she, along with the higher-ups, pulled me from my preferred assignment and put me into recruiting. And I did not know at that time that that was a discriminatory practice, but it made me believe, because I had looked for the rules and there were none. We didn't have a manual that pointed me to the guidelines and rules when I was pregnant. And so I looked for the rules. And so I became an EEO counselor, Equal Employment Opportunity counselor, because I wanted to know those rules. And I also wanted to find out if that was illegal for her to do, and it was. When she pulled me from my preferred assignment, it was just, to me, I was devastated because I thought it was the best job in the Secret Service. And David's heard how I got that job before, and I won't go there, but it was the best job that I thought in the Secret Service, and she pulled me from that assignment. And I could have done that assignment while still pregnant, but when you don't know the rules, it's easy for people to break them, and you just have to deal with it. And then the second story in terms of gender, and there are many, but the second story that stands out is I recall having one of my peers, he's a colleague, come up to me, and he starts his sentence this way. He goes, "Hey, Dee, I know you're probably going to say no because you got the baby, but I want to ask you something." And I stop him right there, and I said, "When have I ever come up to you and say, I know you're going to say no because you've got the 2 kids and the wife?" And so I explained to him at that point, I told him, I said, "You can't say that. You can't come up to me and say that." And I became the queen of you can't say that because, like I said, I was an EEO counselor and I knew the rules. So I put him on notice. You can't say that. That's what, people are talking about microaggressions. That's a microaggression. I was very offended by that because I don't question what you were doing in your household and assignments. And so long story short, he backed off and he was very apologetic, and he was also very embarrassed that I had called him out on that. And that was because of my gender. He assumed that I was going to say no to the assignment. So that was a long way to answer your question, David. Gender.
We had a question here on the Zoom. Driving while black seems to be a potential life-threatening situation all too often. What needs to change to eliminate this national problem? I think they're asking you to solve a lot of big problems in that answer.
Well, I always say I'm not the end-all be-all to all things black, and I can't solve that problem, but these discussions that we have in here, the discussions that you've had in your emergence class, in your ELP classes, the master's program classes, we talk about the hard stuff here, right? And so I believe that when you go back to your own departments, we need to start talking about the hard things. We need to make people around us uncomfortable. We need to get comfortable making others uncomfortable. We need to, I'm going to steal this from Homeland Security. If you see something, say something. If you see what you might think to be a discriminatory action, say something. Call people out. When you say, if you call someone out and you say the things that I said to my colleague, hey, you can't do that. You can't say that. People will listen. So I can't, that's kind of what I'm thinking, David, is just more conversations like this and being uncomfortable and just talking about those things that are in our communities that are making people that look like me afraid to get stopped by the police. And it's not just, the anxiety, it's the statistics that go along with that anxiety that, more often than not, black people they die in a traffic stop more so than any other race.
We have another question. What do you tell young men and women of color about how to respond during police encounters, interactions, and why do you think police departments don't take a more active role explaining how to respond during these interactions, both internally, implicit bias, and externally within communities of color?
Okay, that was a loaded question, so I'll answer it as best I can. What do I tell people of color? I tell them the same things that I'm telling you, that there is no place in law enforcement for implicit bias, and we need to have more diversity, equity, and inclusion conversations, whether they are mass, meetings and conversations, or whether they're just, that table talking to that table about the differences and such. I think that although this country was, born on just race talks and just, racism, I believe that if we start having those conversations with each other, then it will grow. And I don't know how many people have kids, but I talk to my own child about those same stories that I tell you about, and I hope that she understands and knows, hey, while driving while black, this. But also she understands and knows that she's got light skin privilege. It might be not as good as white privilege in terms of being pulled over by a police officer, but she's of a lighter skin, and that does make a difference in policing, as it shouldn't, but it does.
Another one from someone who said that they've been in many situations where they've been able to give advice and counsel high school and college kids of color about going into law enforcement. And they have a challenge of reconciling the color of their skins also with the Black Lives Matter defunding messages and things like that. So the question was, how do you recommend those of us who aren't black to counsel young folks that may want to go into law enforcement?
Okay, well, start by doing exactly that. If you are going into these, schools, colleges, or whatever, and you're talking to people that want to be in law enforcement, I loved it. You guys saw that big Kool-Aid smile I had on my face. I absolutely loved being a cop. So you talk about those things that you love, and then you also talk about those things are problematic in society right now. So you do talk about, defunding police. I don't believe in defunding the police. I believe in reallocating some funds. I believe that police need to be funded, but maybe we reallocate some of that funding to some of the training that we talked about, some community policing policies and such. I don't believe that, I believe that if we start doing those things and we start allowing police officers to get into the communities and know these communities that they are policing, that it's going to be a better day for not just the police departments, but for also the community, because now the community is going to trust you a little more because they've already seen you, and they're not just seeing you for the first time at a traffic stop when you're thinking that they're a bad guy or a bad girl. So those are kind of the things that I would do, just reallocate the funds for more training, more diversity, more inclusion, and then more community policing. Okay, thank you for that question. I will say, while I just retired December of 2020, which was a very contentious year for us because of the George Floyd murder, we started having more conversations like this. But even before that, I told you I became an EEO counselor because I wanted to know the rules. So when I say I became the queen of you can't say that, I truly did. And what that did was put people on notice right then and there without me being nasty or anything about it. Hey, if I heard something, I said, hey, you know what, you can't say that. And my face was on posters everywhere, so you already knew that I knew the rules. And if I told you you couldn't say that, you more than likely can't. You don't want to get yourself in any trouble. So when you fast forward to 2020 and you're talking about race relations and you're talking about, after the George Floyd murder, a lot of agencies, to include mine, opened the doors to have conversation about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and that was a wonderful thing. We had some people that had degrees behind their names that came in and talked to groups of us and talked about those things that we might have experienced both on and off the job, and those were very helpful. But the problem I have with that is they're not ongoing. So you can't have a couple of conversations with individuals in your agency or in your departments and then stop. It has to keep going. These conversations have to keep going and going and going until now my child, my grandchildren, etc., are comfortable driving while black and are comfortable being uncomfortable. So these conversations have to continue. And I will tell you, and David was there when this happened, we were teaching an emergence class, and I said something to the extent of the George Floyd incident. And Chris Bellavita called me out and said, murder. Call it what it is, it's murder. And so from there on, I began to call it what it is, it's murder. Now, in terms of white or other nationalities or whatever, being a part of this conversation, the only way that society is going to work, the only way that our workplaces are going to work, the only way that policing is going to get better is for all of us to be a part of this conversation. And so while I don't necessarily agree with people making you go to these diversity, equity, inclusion classes, I believe that they are helpful, because as long as you get someone that is clinically approved to talk about these things and know how to talk about these hard issues, then I believe that that's going to make a change in not just your department, but other departments. But as long as we skirt around it and not have these hard conversations, then it's not going to work. And conversations as hard as this have to have white people in them too, right? We all have to have these conversations, so it can't just stop and start with black people, because we know what the issues are. We've been going through those issues, but what we want you to know, when I said that these are our truths, we want you to know these are our truths. We aren't just nervous because of this, and we're not just skittish because of that. We're nervous and skittish because they are things that have happened in the past, whether it's to someone that we know or not know, but research is there that show that these things are true, and so we have to actually start doing that. And that's what I would ask everybody in here, regardless of your race or color. Just have these tough conversations, man, and just talk to your peers, talk to people. And as hard as it is to have these conversations, say, I just left CHCS and we were at Apex, and that was a tough conversation that we had. I want to share that with you, and that opens the door. Thank you, I appreciate that. And, I think other people probably have very similar stories to yours, Kelly, and that, you're in these, whether it's a meeting or whatever it is, and you're looking at the news, and everybody looks at the news, right? Everybody knows what's going on. So the conversations that started after the George Floyd murder, we have to keep those conversations valid and ongoing in order for us to move forward as a nation, not just in policing, but as a people. We have to keep those conversations, just continue to have them, as tough as they may be. And so I can't elaborate a lot because in terms of time, but driving while black, statistically, research shows that unfortunately implicit bias comes in, or maybe even maybe some cops might even be scared, and that's where community policing comes in, right? Because if you know your community, then you're not going to be afraid when you pull this person over. But I think I haven't done all the research that I need to do on driving while black, because driving while black female is a little different than driving while black male. Driving while light skin is different than driving while, white. So there are different levels, but I do know that, black men, especially of darker skin, get the worst treatment in terms of driving while black, because of their look, and so can I bring up today in my state, in Georgia, and it kind of goes away from what you're asking, but I just want to bring up, we talk about driving while black. Well, today in Georgia is Ahmaud Arbery Day, so he was running while black, unarmed in a neighborhood, and was killed. And so we're in a community now, and this is completely off script, but we're in a community now that we are looking at situations like that, where Ahmaud Arbery's murderers did not get arrested until I don't know how much longer after it happened, but because of videotape. Because of videotape. If there was no videotape, even with the George Floyd murder, if there was no videotape, I don't want to live in a world where I have to have a videotape to prove that things aren't what they are. And so I'm completely off that. I kind of went on a tangent just because it is Ahmaud Arbery Day, and that's what they're celebrating, 2 years of his death today in Georgia. So those are stories that we shouldn't hear about. We shouldn't hear about George Floyd's. We shouldn't hear about Ahmaud Arbery's. And I don't want to hear about any other, whether you're Hispanic, black, or white, police shootings that are not supposed to happen. Now, let me get back to your Hispanic part of your question. I think that's poor on the agency's part when you don't have people, a mixed combination of people, and that's a recruiting issue. And so while you're a part of APT, become a part of recruiting. And you don't have to be a recruiter to recruit. When I got to Atlanta, there was no one that looked like me in that office. So I went, it's a big HBCU place, historically black colleges and universities. It's a big HBCU place. I aligned myself, because I was already a recruiter in other places, with those universities. I wanted people to come in and see what the Secret Service had to offer. And so we had internships. I started with just going to those colleges and talking to their folks and saying, hey, can we come in here and maybe get some of your students to come see what the Secret Service is about? You have criminal justice majors, we would love to have them as our interns. And we had paid internships and pathway programs, and we were able to do that. And before I left, I saw people that looked like me because I put them there. Even though they were students, these were students now that were going to be able to tell other students. So take ownership of your own recruiting processes in your own agencies, because if you love your agency, you want people, if you can go to McDonald's and find somebody, literally, that you might want to work with you. And tell that person, hey, you know what, I work at such and such. I don't know how long you're going to do this, but I'd love for you to call me and come in and talk and see what we offer here. So just a recruiting problem there. Any other questions?
I think that is it. Dee, thank you so much.
You're welcome.